At its core, a society makes a specific promise that the legal code will act as an equalizer, guaranteeing baseline fairness within a community. That promise dictates exactly how vulnerable workers must be treated. It mandates fixed hourly limits, guarantees fair wages, and requires industrial environments to be physically safe to navigate. The government drafts these rules to act as a counterweight. They step in as the architect, preventing large, resource-rich corporations from extracting labor at the expense of human well-being. Read strictly as a text, this legal framework neutralizes the extreme power imbalance between an individual worker and a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. But when we step outside the text, a glaring contradiction emerges. If these exact regulations are codified law, factory collapses, lethal chemical spills, and severe exploitation still happen with alarming frequency. Major industrial players routinely identify and exploit blind spots in these protocols, subjecting their workforce to the exact hazards the legislation was written to prevent. Writing the legislation is only step one. A legal code, standing entirely on its own, fractures under the weight of systemic economic pressure. There is a massive divide between passing a rule in a state house and actually achieving justice on a factory floor. The public is owed 3 pillars of protection: physical safety, fair compensation, and strict environmental boundaries, like mandatory waste treatment. For these to hold steady, the government must step in as active regulators, directly inspecting industrial facilities. Regulators must apply severe financial and legal penalties to violators. Without the threat of real consequences, compliance depends entirely on the voluntary goodwill of corporations built to maximize profit. The written code outlines the ideal, but aggressive, continuous enforcement is the actual mechanism that drives industrial justice. The breakdown occurs in a very specific space. We call it the implementation gap, the physical distance between the passage of a bill and the moment a regulator knocks on a factory door. The first major obstacle in this gap is compromised oversight. Understaffed regulatory agencies and systemic corruption frequently create an environment where inspectors simply look the other way. Second, companies calculate the risks. They intentionally bypass safety protocols and environmental filters to drastically lower operating costs and achieve reckless acceleration in their output. Third, there is a severe information deficit. Vulnerable workers are often kept completely unaware of their legal rights, making them incapable of reporting the violations happening right in front of them. When compromised oversight meets calculated corporate cost-cutting and a workforce kept in the dark, the result is a continuous loop of unchecked pollution and human abuse. This gap is not a bureaucratic accident. It is a highly predictable vulnerability that profit-driven entities actively utilize to maintain their economic dominance. Because the state's internal enforcement is fallible, a fair system requires pressure from outside the legislative walls to maintain accountability. The system requires a third party to complete the circuit. It requires an educated, watchful public. When regulators fail, consumer awareness becomes a direct and highly effective mechanism for compliance. By refusing to purchase from brands that pollute rivers or exploit labor, consumers target the singular metric that drives corporate behavior: their revenue streams. An organized population wields its capital as a regulatory tool, enforcing a layer of financial accountability that raw legislation struggles to achieve on its own. A written law is, ultimately, just a set of instructions. It provides the theoretical blueprint for a fair society, but it cannot enforce itself. Building that society requires 2 mechanical forces operating simultaneously: a state government willing to heavily penalize violations, and a vigilant consumer base ready to act when the state fails. Without both elements, the legal code remains ink on paper. Equality only exists in practice when collective action actively forces it into reality.